A city like Boston can have many cultures with different labels, but it's more difficult to identify a single local flavor. One approach is to look where culture meets everyday life, especially for buying tickets and products or showing up at a free event. That's where advertising comes in, along with media from mainstream outlets to alternative weeklies, posters, and flyers. It's also where Boston reality meets the aspirational and the imaginary. And you can find hundreds more examples in the second installment of Buy Me Boston. Our guest is its curator, Brian Coleman. Thank you very much for being with us, Brian.
It's a real pleasure, always. Thank you.
Brian, this is a volume two. At one level, it's more of the same thing in full color. Why the second helping?
I think the basic thing is with the first volume, I had so much left over. And I've done with my hip hop book series called Check the Technique, doing a sequel is always either you're greedy or you just feel that you've left some stuff on the table with the first one. And greed is not the reason to get into doing a book like I'm doing. So it was definitely the second. So there was just so much. I mean, I literally have thousands of images. I looked the other day, I have about 3,500 pages scanned of different things that catch my eye that I could use potentially for volume 7 if I want. So that'll be the whole thing. So I just felt like there was enough that I thought people would still enjoy it. And I widened the net of the people that I used, archives and just private citizens, and it was fun. It was just as fun as the first time, and I like a challenge. So the whole thing when you do a sequel or a volume 4 or 5, etc., is you can't make it worse. It has to be better. So that drove me along the way. Each step really is like, is this worthy? Are people going to be like, oh man, he just mailed it in? So yeah, I'm proud of it. I like it. And so we'll see how it goes. It just came out. So.
Well, you're a collector of cultural artifacts, but you're also a collector of collectors. You have someone who helped a lot in this book. David Beaver wrote the preface. One thing he said struck me, every ad is a dream. Is there any ad that you would point to that really exemplifies that?
I mean, I don't know. I think they kind of all are. I mean, I think the earlier ones of any kind of any enterprise. So for example, in volume 1, there was a fairly early ad for Legal Seafoods when they were just a little teeny place in Inman Square, and they had folk music over on the side, and in the early 70s, and it was in a kind of a new age publication called the East West Journal. So you can certainly, I could put together almost not obviously as well as Legal Seafood, but I could put together the development of their advertising campaigns and now look at them. Similarly, Newbury Comics, so I love to see, my favorite things are the companies, the performers, the enterprises that are still here, because my cutoff date for these books is 1989, and that was a long time ago. So if you're still around, especially Legal Seafood, going back that far, it's pretty amazing, especially after this year that we've all gone through.
One of the more obvious dreams that I picked up on was the American Revolution for WBCN, which reminded me of the BCN I got to know in 1968 more than the BCN later. But isn't that one example too?
Definitely. I mean, you can definitely see the earlier ads. I guess that's always the trick, and that's why I do like doing in-person events sometimes, because you can see the development. I show one ad usually for BCN. I probably have 2 or 3 related ads in this book, but I could present 30, 40, 50 WBCN ads, in part because one of the patrons of this whole enterprise when it comes to sources is David Bieber, who worked there for a long time. So yeah, I mean, BCN is a true, incredible Boston story. And they're well known and well documented, and they were obviously a media powerhouse. Then on the flip side of that is something that a lot of people aren't aware of, which would be the People's Yellow Pages, which is in the very front of the book. And that was an enterprise that started in 1971 and went for over a decade. So that's kind of the beauty to me, is that you can have a BCN that became this monolithic force, not only regionally and locally, but nationally and internationally. And then you can have something like the People's Yellow Pages that actually did have a pretty impressive impact nationally, but on a much smaller scale. And so for me, presenting them both equally is important.
You know, people in Boston, even who are younger than us, they know about some of these counterculture destinations like the Boston Tea Party. But this book has artifacts from a number of venues for up and coming Black musicians in Boston. Tell us a little bit about those.
Yeah, I mean, that one of the interesting things at the very end of the process of volume two was I connected with a very legendary, amazing guy from Roxbury named Bobby Taylor, who's known as the Silver Shadow. He's a DJ. He does kind of what he would consider to be kind of more of the oldies circuit. And so he had starting in 1983, he had a uh, event that was about Madison Park kind of reunion from going back to his running partners in the 50s. So I was able to slide in a couple of his at places like Biff's, like Lounge, and there are so many amazing places, Estelle's and Roscoe's and
Sugar Shack.
Sugar Shack for sure. That is honestly, the Sugar Shack's almost too easy and too beautiful. I mean, that hasn't been documented as much. Like if you take the flip side of the Sugar Shack and like BCN, that's kind of the story of Boston, is how, you know, these two of the sides of Boston. And I try and present everything equally on equal ground, so that the Strand is just as important as anything that happened at the Boston Garden. So that's kind of the importance for me. And I do like to kind of shine a light on you. You'll notice one of the things I did add in volume two was a lot of ticket stubs from different venues, some of them very obscure. I mean, there are VFW halls in Alston and kind of smaller places that would house more like gospel and R&B shows in Roxbury and Mattapan. So yeah, I think the whole thing with the book is to present everything on an even playing field and not emphasize one thing over another.
Well, it's also interesting to see how the music business involved, you know, a presence in different spheres. I mean, BCM was famous for that, but you also have something there from Skippy White, because he ran a record shop. You know, he was on WILD with a show, and you have this hit list, all these songs by Little Richard. Tell me a little bit how that worked.
I mean, that was just part of Skippy. Skippy had a newsletter, you know, that he would put out back in the 60s. And that was just one page out of dozens, hundreds of pages of these kind of tip sheets. There are all kinds of things like, you know, there was a Boston record pool in the 70s and they had their own tip sheet. There was Nightfall magazine, which is one of my personal favorites, that was kind of very discotheque oriented starting in 1975. So yeah, I mean, Skippy is a legend, and he just closed his last store. I actually about 2 weeks ago drove by the Eggleston location, and the sign is down, and I kind of a tear ran down my cheek a little bit. But you know, Skippy's still around. He's still on the radio every weekend, and so Skippy, yet again, that's another success story. Skippy was working in the record store business going back to the late 50s with Smile and Jack's, and then started his own store in the early 60s. So Skippy's a legend and an amazing guy. And yet again, there are a lot of people I lean on for information, for context with these books. I am not someone who lectures. I try and present things. The 60s would be particularly ridiculous for me to lecture anyone on, because I wasn't born until 1970. So I am very much reliant on people like Skippy and David Bieber and Kay Bourne to kind of help me contextualize things so that I understand well enough that I can explain it. But I think the other thing about the books too is I don't present them, there's almost no text. The only text in the books is where I got it from and the date. And That's on purpose because I don't want this to be an academic. I like that it's a reference because there is an index in the back, but I don't want it to become an academic exercise because it should be fun and it shouldn't be bogged down by a lot of text either, I don't think.
Well, there's one interesting institution here, and it straddles the categories of places to eat and places for performance, and that's Bob the Chefs. And they do have a sort of a successor at the same location, but what you have from them is a calendar.
Yeah. I mean, that's a perfect example of something that, I mean, Bob the Chefs was such an important, it was a place to eat clearly, but there are places, I mean, the Middle East over in Cambridge has this, it's more of a, you know, a Cheers. I feel bad making a Cheers reference, but it is a place that people's families were centered. You would just stop by to say hello, even if you weren't getting something to eat. And then David Bieber had a 1977 calendar that is something you would put up in your kitchen or on your refrigerator. And it was still on January 1977 in very typical David Bieber fashion in mint condition. And it was just in a random pile over at his incredible archive over in Norwood. So yeah, it's important to me to present places. Bob's Chefs is a perfect example of a neighborhood anchor, what I would, you know, certainly term that. And other things too. It doesn't have to be a physical space necessarily too. You'll certainly, you mentioned WBCN, but you'll notice my WILD obsession. There's a lot more WILD in the book than there is WBCN. That's not necessarily because they were a bigger station, but they, in my mind, were just as important and don't get anywhere near as much attention from just generally from historians as I think they should. So sometimes I tip the scale a little bit. I said before I present everything on an even playing field, but sometimes I actually do tip the scales towards things that I do feel don't get talked about as much as they should.
You know, there are many things in this book that intrigue me a lot, like the overlaps between sports and businesses in the city. I mean, even between the Boston Bruins and Bob Lee's Islander,
Yeah.
Which I noticed when I went to some of the hockey games, but I never figured out what's going on here. But let me ask you about, there's one other thing that intrigued me here, and that is about some of the neighborhood performances site, because this isn't about just big names coming into Boston. This is about where young people from the neighborhoods get a chance to perform. And there were places, I think, in Dorchester where that was going on. LL Cool J would play for a while, and then all the kids would get up and show their stuff.
Yeah, I mean, there was a huge, I recently was looking at a poster that was that's not in the book because it came in actually after the book was already out, but it was a Maurice Starr had a Hollywood Talent Night, was his famous kind of talent shows, and he had some at the Strand, but he had also some at the Lee School. I actually never knew this too, and this is yet again what comes from talking to people who were there. He also tried at least one, if not more, in Providence in that same era in the mid 80s, and it didn't really go very well. So that was kind of proof of Maurice's drawing power locally and how powerful that was versus when you try to go a little bit outside your network. Even Maurice Starr didn't work. So yeah, I mean, it's always super important to have local places on a smaller scale where artists can kind of really try things out. You know, talent shows are the ultimate place for that, for sure. But you also have places like the Rat in Kenmore Square that is legendary, and legendary for a reason. I mean, you think of all the legendary stuff that went on at the Rat, but when they started presenting more kind of original music in 1974, just like CBGB's in New York, it wasn't destined to succeed. They just didn't really have anything better to do. So they were just like, yeah, sure. I mean, if you don't break anything, go ahead. And things started growing out of that because people kind of glommed around it and really were creative, and they accomplished incredible things.
Finally, speaking of places where young creatives can try things out, you're going to be at one of these places pretty soon talking about this book.
Yes, I will be this two events. I love doing in-person events. Obviously, 2020 is 2020, and this was a tricky time to put out the book that I love to do. I mean, I like doing these live events as much as I like putting out the books. So we're doing something at the Dorchester Art Project, which is amazing, kind of I would call it a hive of activity for all kinds of artists. A lot of social activism comes out of the Dorchester Art Project. It's on Dorchester Avenue in Fields Corner. You can just go to dorchesterartproject.com. Beyond my event, which will be on Thursday, the 3rd in the evening, and then Saturday, the 5th in the kind of late afternoon, 4 o'clock-ish. We'll be doing very limited, literally like 10, 12 people at a time, 3 different sessions a day. And it's really just to gather people in a room. I mean, I know it's a weird time to do it. It'll also be live streamed. It's in collaboration with Dig Boston. I think Dorchester Art Project is the perfect, and the book is for sale. They have a brand new store there on the street level right there. And it's just the kind of place I love. I mean, I'm a punk kid. Like, I come out of the punk scene in the mid 80s. And so that's exactly what that is. I mean, there's not a lot of punk going on there, but it's that attitude. It's the attitude of young people's energy joining together to do good stuff. So yeah, so for me, it's an absolute thrill to do something there. And all the proceeds are going to go towards the Dorchester Art Project, not at all to me, because I want to try and support them.
And finally, if people want to track down the book, if they cannot be at that event?
Yeah, it's available locally all over the place. I mean, it's at Newbury Comics, Brookline Booksmith, some record stores. Also, I have a website. It's just Buy Me Boston, BUY me boston.com, and you can order direct from me. I am purposely not selling it on Amazon because this is a local book, and people should not be supporting something that's not local. So so I'm proud of that. And yeah, it's great. I'm already on the 2nd printing, and it's only been out for like 2 weeks. So I guess people are enjoying it so far. So we'll see.
And I especially treasured that page of price tags from Filene's Basement. Great job. Thank you very much for being with us, Brian.
Thank you, Chris. It's a pleasure. Thank you.
That's Brian Coleman for Volume 2 of Buy Me Boston.